There's a whole generation of people who were raised on latchkeys and MTV, who remember the world before the internet but adapted to it anyway, who watched their parents work for companies that didn't work for them, and who learned very early that no one was coming to save them. They're not boomers, though they're often lumped in with them. They're not millennials, though they raised a lot of them. They're Generation X, and psychologically they might be one of the most misunderstood and quietly resilient groups alive today. If you're Gen X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you're not, stick around, because understanding this generation is like getting a masterclass in survival, skepticism, and the art of staying low-key while everything around you burns. Let me paint you a picture of what it was like to grow up Gen X, because context is everything when we're talking about psychology. You came home from school to an empty house, not because your parents didn't love you, but because both of them had to work. Or maybe there was only one parent, because divorce rates skyrocketed in the 70s and 80s. You let yourself in with a key you wore around your neck. You made your own snack. You did your homework. Or you didn't. You watched TV, played outside until the streetlights came on, and you figured things out on your own because there was no one hovering, no one optimizing your childhood, no one tracking your location on an app. This wasn't neglect in the clinical sense, though for some it crossed that line. For most, it was just the culture. It was what childhood looked like, and it fundamentally shaped the psychological wiring of an entire generation. What this created was a deep, almost bone-level self-reliance. Gen X learned early that they had to take care of themselves. There was no instruction manual. There were no participation trophies. There was no constant affirmation that you were special. You were just a kid, and you had to figure it out. And you did. You became resourceful. You became independent. And you became, perhaps more than any generation before or since, deeply suspicious of institutions, authority, and anyone promising that things were going to be okay. Because you watched things fall apart. You saw the economy tank in the early 90s. You saw your parents lose jobs after decades of loyalty. You saw the Cold War paranoia, the AIDS crisis, the rise of cynicism in media and music. Grunge wasn't just a sound, it was a mood. It was Kurt Cobain saying out loud what a lot of Gen Xers felt quietly, that the world was broken, that promises were empty, and that trying too hard was kind of embarrassing. There's a term psychologists use called learned helplessness, but Gen X developed almost the opposite. Call it learned self-sufficiency. The message wasn't that nothing you do matters. The message was that no one else is going to do it for you, so you better handle it yourself. And they did. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without posting about it. And that's another key psychological trait of Gen X, their relationship with visibility. They are, by and large, allergic to self-promotion. They grew up in a world where being too eager, too earnest, too try-hard was social suicide. Cool meant detached. Cool meant ironic. Cool meant acting like you didn't care, even if you did. This wasn't emotional unavailability, though it could look like that. It was armor. It was protection against a world that felt unstable and unimpressed. Fast forward to today, and Gen X finds itself in a strange position. They're sandwiched between boomers who won't retire and millennials who won't stop talking. They're in their 40s and 50s now, often at the peak of their careers, often raising teenagers or young adults, often taking care of aging parents, and they're doing all of it with the same quiet competence they learned as kids. But here's the thing. No one is checking in on them. No one is asking if they're okay. Because Gen X doesn't ask for help. They were trained not to. And psychologically, that creates both strength and vulnerability. On one hand, Gen Xers are extraordinarily adaptable. They've lived through massive technological change. They went from rotary phones to smartphones, from card catalogs to Google, from writing letters to texting, and they didn't resist it. They just learned it. They didn't complain about it on TikTok because TikTok didn't exist yet, and even if it did, they probably wouldn't bother. They just adapted, the way they always have. But there's also a cost. That self-reliance can become isolation. That skepticism can become cynicism. That emotional restraint can become suppression. Gen X is statistically less likely to seek therapy than younger generations. They're less likely to talk openly about mental health. Not because they don't struggle, they absolutely do, but because they were raised in an era where you didn't talk about it. You just dealt with it. You put on a Nirvana album, maybe you had a cigarette, and moved on. There's research suggesting that Gen X has some of the highest rates of anxiety and depression among adult age groups, but they're also the least likely to seek treatment. And that tracks, doesn't it? Because asking for help feels vulnerable, and vulnerability was never modeled for them. Their parents didn't go to therapy. Their teachers didn't teach emotional literacy. Feelings were private. You handled your business, and you didn't make it anyone else's problem. But here's where I want to pause and reframe something, because this isn't a story of damage. It's a story of resilience that came with a price tag. Gen X survived. They survived economic instability, cultural pessimism, the erosion of social safety nets, and they did it without the constant validation that younger generations have access to. They learned to be okay with not being okay. They learned to find meaning in small things, a good song, an honest conversation, a dry sense of humor that cuts through the noise. They don't need you to like them. They don't need to be seen. They just need to get through the day and maybe enjoy it a bit if possible. And that creates a very specific kind of psychological profile. Gen X tends to be pragmatic, not idealistic. They've seen too many movements fail, too many promises broken. They're not cynics because they hate hope. They're cynics because hope disappointed them early and often. But underneath that cynicism is something else. It's not despair, it's realism. It's the ability to look at the world clearly without rose-colored glasses and still find a way to function. There's also a deep loyalty in Gen X, though it's not loud. They're loyal to their people, their friends, their chosen family, because they learned that blood doesn't always mean safety, and institutions don't always have your back. So you find your tribe and you hold on. Gen X friendships span decades. They're not transactional. They're not performative. They're just there. Steady, low maintenance. You don't need to text every day. You can pick up right where you left off 5 years later, and that's fine. Let's talk about parenting for a second, because if you're a millennial or Gen Z, chances are you were raised by a Gen X parent or had one nearby. And the way Gen X parents is psychologically telling. They tend to give their kids more freedom than boomers did, but more structure than they had themselves. They learned from being left alone too much, but they also don't want to suffocate. They're trying to find a middle ground, though they'll never say that out loud. They're the parents who will let you fail, because they know failure teaches you something. They're also the parents who are secretly anxious about money, about stability, about whether anything they're building will last, because they watched their own parents lose everything. Gen X doesn't believe in the American dream the way boomers did. They believe in backup plans. They believe in side hustles before side hustles were trendy. They believe in keeping your head down and your expectations low, not because they're pessimists, but because they're realists who've been disappointed before. And yet, despite all of this, or maybe because of it, Gen X has this fascinating psychological flexibility. They don't cling to one identity. They don't need the world to validate their existence. They're comfortable with contradictions. They can love capitalism and hate it. They can be cynical and hopeful. They can care deeply and pretend they don't. They contain multitudes, and they don't feel the need to explain themselves. There's a quietness to Gen X that's misunderstood as apathy, but it's not apathy. It's conservation of energy. It's knowing that outrage is exhausting, and that most fights aren't worth having. It's picking your battles. It's surviving in a world that never quite made space for you by making your own space and not asking permission. So if you're Gen X and you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, stuck between generations that get all the attention, I want you to hear this. You're not invisible. You're just not loud. And that's not a weakness. You've been holding things together quietly for decades. You've adapted without complaining. You've survived without a handbook. And that matters. The world needs your realism. It needs your resilience. It needs people who don't need constant applause to keep going. So, tell me, are you Gen X or do you know one? What's something about this generation that you think gets misunderstood? Drop it in the comments. And if this hit home, subscribe. Let's keep digging into what makes us who we are. One generation, one psychology, one honest conversation at a time.